Dianne is a positive woman and she's a peer in this industry who was diagnosed in the late stages of HIV in March last year. Dianne is the mother of 4 children and she's in a happy relationship with a negative partner. And so we're very privileged today to have Dianne to tell her story to us. Thanks, Dianne.
Well, I guess my purpose today is to give you an insight into my journey. As Susan just said, it's quite a recent diagnosis, so it's still very fresh with me and resonates quite strongly. I guess to give you a bit of a history of who I am, I'm an Australian-born woman in my mid-40s, born in the outback and raised in the outback of Western Australia in the Pilbara region. So I was raised with a you can do it, tough sort of mentality and a real survivor's sort of approach to life, as many outback people do. I had quite an adventurous life. I've lived overseas in the United States of America. I married an American and we had 3 children together. I found living in America quite difficult and really missed home, missed the sunshine, the ocean, and the wonderful aspects of Australia that I grew up with, and wanted my children to have that in their life. So hence we came back to Australia. Things went downhill not long after that, and after 9 years of marriage I decided to leave the relationship. In doing so, because of the nature of what happened, it involved domestic violence, I decided to bring my children to Sydney. Being mixed-race children, I thought it would be a better environment to raise them in, a bit more acceptance and feeling a bit more normal with the community. So we lived in the inner city area of Sydney, which was a bit of a culture shock for me, coming from country Western Australia. The children and I fared fairly well, but found that we, with no family and no connections, needed to sort of bond with some kind of a community. I was hopeful that things would go well and, some stability would come to my life for myself and the children. And very quickly he asked me to have a child because, as was stated before, in those cultures, having children, having large families is a sign of doing very well and is quite the norm. So quickly I became pregnant and had a child. But it wasn't long after I was pregnant I started to realise that our cultural differences were quite significant. The way that they do relationships and the way that Western people do relationships were quite different. And that became a conflict. As time went by, I quickly realised that he wasn't who he said he was. And I found out, or I started to become suspicious of the fact that his identity wasn't the identity that he gave, and that he was a person who'd used a false identity. Things weren't adding up, and as I approached him about these things, he became quite violent. Basically said, if you're going to get in my way, I'm going to put you in the ground. So it became quite a severe situation and I was quite afraid for my life. Needless to say, I went to the police and got involved with the AVO system and managed to have him removed from my home. We had a small child at that time and he was 6 months old, and I was pretty much a person left with no self-esteem at that stage. I decided, as my background was to be strong and resilient, that this wasn't going to break me, and that even though I was now a single mother of 4 children and one of them just an infant, I went and picked myself up and started looking at how I was going to move forward. I ended up going to university and getting a degree in social science, and found myself eventually working with women in domestic violence, oddly enough. Didn't go looking for that, but it sort of came to me. And at first I was a bit concerned, about counter-transference of my previous life, but I found that I was quite good at it and I could have good empathy with the clients and really enjoyed being part of the process of watching people go through change and watching women grow and watching families being supported and moving forward as I had experienced myself and I had received support earlier in my journey. I was very damaged from that relationship and so therefore chose to stay alone, and you know, going to university doesn't afford you much time to develop relationships anyway. Time went by and over that journey things started to get better. I got work, I finished my degree, I felt a real sense of achievement. I felt I'd shown my children that against all odds you can rise up and you can make your life your own. That was really wonderful, and then during that journey I actually met a man, and he very graciously, very slowly developed a friendship and a relationship with me, and finally won me over, and we started a relationship. That was 2009, and I thought finally maybe now things were going to come together and I could, you know, move forward the way that I envisioned my life many years ago. 2010, I started getting quite sick, to the point that I was sick for about 3 months with this terrible cough. I had fatigue, no energy. I went from one GP to another GP to another GP. In that process, everybody says, oh, you've got a chest infection, because I have a history with asthma and bronchial infections, and felt that, you know, I should just take some antibiotics, some steroids, prednisone, and I should get better. It wasn't happening. It got to the point where I found myself struggling to even walk. Because I think in my mind I was thinking doctors are professional and they know what they're doing. I never went to the hospital. I only ever went to GPs. And I started thinking I was going crazy. I started thinking that, you know, this was all in my mind. My partner kept saying to me, you need to go to the hospital. And in my mind I'm thinking, well, hang on. If something was really wrong, these doctors would pick it up. And I trusted the system. They took x-rays, everything that could happen. Later I was to find out that at that time I had a PCP. So I was a pretty sick person at that time. But fortunately for me, one of the doctors misdiagnosed me and said, it sounds like you've got whooping cough, because it went on for 3-4 months. And he's given me Bactrim, back-to-back, double dose. I got well. So there was no need to investigate any further. Okay, it's whooping cough, you know. There's an answer to my problem there. I am at work and life is now swimmingly moving forward. Really loving my work in domestic violence and feeling very fulfilled with life. One day I was at work and I had just dropped a client to a refuge. I'm sure many of you know that refuges are secret places, and so the addresses and that are not divulged. And my manager wasn't aware of the addresses of where I was going. I just dropped the client and one of the workers had stepped out and one of the other workers was doing an intake, and she said to me, listen, can you just stay here until I finish the intake, and then you know, I'll take over looking after your client, just sit with your client for now. So I did that, and as I was doing that, I sat there and I looked down at my hand and I saw some car keys in my hand, and I suddenly realised I need to go somewhere. Why have I got keys in my hand? And then I found myself asking, where am I going? And then I realised I didn't know where I was. And before I knew it, I started realising I didn't know who I was. And I was very frightened. I started trembling, and I remember saying, I'm scared, and that was it. I don't remember anything thereafter. Apparently I seized, and apparently the poor client, frightened as she was going to a refuge, picked up my work phone and rang my manager, and my poor manager was in a mess. because she couldn't direct an ambulance anywhere. She didn't know where I was. She didn't know how to direct help to me. I think the client must have managed to raise the other worker, and quickly they got an ambulance, and I awoke in ER quite confused, quite dazed, didn't know my name, didn't know where I worked. All the questions that were asked of me really had no answer to. They did a CAT scan and managed to find my partner and get him from work and get him down there. He got down there and next minute a doctor walked up and said, look, I've got really bad news for you. I'm very sorry, but you've got secondary brain cancer. We've found 5 tumours on your brain. My partner was furious. He said, don't accept that. Don't accept that. That's not right. He said, you can't just walk up to her and say that like that and walk off. Anyway, the doctor walked off and left us there. For the next few days, I was being carted around for MRIs and other scans to find the primary cancer. And I had a biopsy, I think it was about 4 days later. After the biopsy, I remember all these doctors coming to see me and asking me questions. Tell us about the time you were sick before. That's when I was having the trouble breathing and the chest infections and so on. And what did the doctor give you? And then you got better. Do you own a cat? Do you have a cat? I'm thinking, what in the world has a cat got to do with my brain? But very quickly they explained to me about toxoplasmosis and suggested that it might be possible that that's what's on my brain and it's not brain cancer. And in order to determine that, we need to do a HIV test. When I was first married, before I married my husband, because he was from a high-risk country, I did have a HIV test, so I knew I was negative at that stage. Post-marriage, I think when you enter into a relationship that's supposed to be based on trust, you don't concern yourself with that. And of course, when I was pregnant with my child, who was at that stage that I was diagnosed 8 years old, I didn't bother to check up on that because I'd had one just before we'd married. And he had told me that he had. I never saw any results, but I trusted that what he'd told me was correct. During that breakup of that relationship, there was a question in the back of my head that was just eating at me. Why did he lie about his identity? What was that all about? Because I knew he was from a wealthy family. I knew he was educated, and I couldn't understand what the desperation was to deceive me or to change his identity to come into this country. I mean, we can only assume and presume, we can't speak with facts. But it sort of cleared the air once I got my diagnosis. That day, the staff, I think it was a social worker and a doctor came in to tell me my diagnosis after I was put back in the ward from recovery. And they said, you know that test? Yes. They nodded. What a relief I felt. I can't explain the mass relief because I thought secondary brain cancer, this is going to be a hard fight. But HIV, I could do this. I must have known enough then as a general person that there were the new medications and that the research was being done and that pioneering work was being done, and I felt safe in that, and I knew that I had the will and that I had the resilience to fight that fight. But then the question abode, well, how long have I been sick? And they said, well, given where you're at, because my CD4 was 40, where you're at with the opportunistic infections, I think I had probably about 4 or 5 of them, we would suspect you've been positive for 9 to 10 years. Hang on a minute, I've got an 8-year-old son. Panic just took over. I didn't care about my health, but what about my little boy? I didn't know enough to know that, you know, he would have presented probably sooner. So the doctors weren't overly concerned, but for me as a mother, I needed to get that one sorted before I could do anything else. And I think the hospital was sort of focusing on, let's get her well and then let's deal with that. So there was a bit of a struggle there in that sense. But I fought and pushed, and I got him tested. And the social workers at the paediatric unit were wonderful, the doctor was wonderful, and my brave little boy, he was just adorable. I explained to him that this was a blood-borne virus, and because he was in my tummy and I had it, there was a risk he might have it and he needs to have a test. Explained, how it's a risk. And he said to me, well, Mummy, you better hurry up and get me tested. He wasn't afraid at all, and I said, well, what are you going to do if it comes up positive? And he said, well, I'll take my medication and I'll just be very careful that I don't get a blood nose when I'm playing sports. He was more concerned about infecting anyone else than about his own welfare. He handled that very well, and it turned out that he was negative. So even though I was probably positive while pregnant and breastfed, we were blessed with a healthy boy. So that sort of made my journey a lot better. And once he got his diagnosis, he turned to the social worker and said, well, let's just focus on getting Mummy well now. 12 months on, my viral load was undetectable, my CD4 went up. Long-term treatment for the toxo was successful, and things got a lot better. Being a person who works in a field that works with women in crisis, I found a few things a bit overwhelming. One of the first things I noticed when I was in hospital was everybody was telling me, be quiet, don't say anything to anyone, keep this to yourself. And I was quite overwhelmed because I thought, how are we going to deal with discrimination and stigma if we're telling people to be quiet? Because automatically there's an underlying stigma being sent to me as a message that I am a pariah or I have something wrong. Okay, if I had cancer, would they tell me that? This is what I'm thinking to myself. So I made a conscious decision then that with the background that I have and my resilient nature and with the work experience that I have and learning experience, educational experience, that I needed to turn this negative into a positive. And the only way to do that is to stand out there and spread a message, and let's squash this discrimination. Let's let people know what's going on, and let's normalise this, because HIV doesn't choose who it comes to. It only asks you one thing: are you human? It doesn't matter your gender, it doesn't matter your country of birth, your ethnicity, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, anyone who is sexually active is at risk. I thought I was safe in a marriage. I thought I was safe trusting my partner. I thought I did all the right things. There was a time when red flags did come up. I had a lump in my neck, on my lymph gland, for 9 years. Oncology had a look at it. No, it's not cancer. Well, we don't need to look at that anymore. I now realise that if I was a HIV gay man, I probably would have been given if I was a gay man, I would have been given a HIV test. But because I was a Caucasian, mother, Australian woman, it was never suggested at any point. Now that I look back at that timeline, I can see the journey. I can see what happened to me. And I'm actually quite blessed with what's happened since my diagnosis. I believe that I've changed as a person. I believe it's been a very positive experience. It hasn't been easy. I've had to stop work. Unfortunately, I did receive discrimination at work as I resisted the need to hide my status. Some of it was just simply uninformed reasonings behind it. I have a partner who is negative, and he's been my rock. He's my biggest cheerleader and stood behind me through all this. And the same with my children, who range from 19 down to 10. And they're all like, Mum, you do what you've got to do and we're right behind you. And they want me to be a voice. They want me to support other women and other heterosexual positive people. I'm blessed in that sense, and my partner has recently asked me to marry him, and things have just gone from better to excellent, and they're only going to get better. But people had their own belief systems or their own ideas of what should or could happen, and a lot of people felt that my partner was going to leave me because he was negative. Well, that didn't happen. And unfortunately, you know, it became quite difficult for people to navigate. I think it's important for me to let people know I'm okay with this, and I have nothing to feel shame about, and I'm very, very proud of my character and who I've become. And I've met some beautiful people. I've connected with, through the women's group, I've connected with some beautiful women, and it was so nice to see that there are others out there. Unfortunately, a lot of them feel that they can't come forward. So I'm quite happy to be that voice, and I'm quite happy to let you know that, you know, everybody out there, no matter what their circumstance, no matter how they were infected, just like any of us in here, wonderful, lovely people, and they're getting on with their life. And we're so grateful for what the medical and the science have done for us. And this being World AIDS Week, World AIDS Day week, resonates with me very strongly, because I think about those that have passed. Those, I think in Australia it was about 6,200, I think roughly, have passed in Australia, and you know, their fight and their journey, and I feel obligated to stand behind them and continue that, and not let the good work they've done and their losses go in vain.
So thanks, Dianne.